The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the wooden platform where the monthly auction was taking place. It was 1885, and the frontier town buzzed with the usual mix of cattle buyers, land speculators, and folks looking to settle debts or make fresh starts. But today's auction held something different, something that made even the hardened cowboys shift uncomfortably in their boots. Standing on the weathered platform, her chin held high despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks, was Evangeline Ross. At 26, she possessed a statuesque beauty that commanded attention wherever she went. Her golden hair caught the sunlight like spun wheat, and her green eyes held a fire that spoke of spirit unbroken despite her circumstances. She was tall for a woman of her time, standing nearly 5 feet 8 inches, with curves that filled out her simple blue dress in ways that made some men stare and others look away in discomfort. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Clarence Hobbs, wiped sweat from his brow as he gestured toward Evangeline with obvious reluctance. This wasn't the kind of auction he preferred to conduct. But debt was debt and the law was the law. Now then, folks, Hobbs called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, we have here Miss Evangeline Ross, formerly of the Ross boarding house. Due to outstanding debts following her father's passing, she's agreed to enter into a work contract to satisfy said obligations. Evangeline's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them clasped in front of her, determined not to show weakness. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving her with a boarding house mortgaged beyond its worth and debts that stretched longer than a winter night. The bank had been patient, but patience had its limits, and those limits had been reached. In the crowd, men whispered among themselves, some with calculating eyes and others with expressions that made Evangeline's skin crawl. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for it as best she could, but standing here like livestock for sale stripped away every dignity she'd tried to preserve. She's a fine cook and housekeeper, Hobbs continued, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. Educated, too, can read and write and cipher numbers. Contract would be for 2 years to work off the debt of $800. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $800 was a substantial sum, more than most working men saw in 3 years. I'll start the bidding at $50, Hobbs announced. A portly man in an expensive suit raised his hand. 50, he called out, his small eyes gleaming as they roved over Evangeline's figure. Another voice chimed in from the back. 75. This from a rancher known for working his help hard and paying them little. Evangeline felt her stomach turn as the bidding continued, each raised hand feeling like another nail in the coffin of her freedom. She tried to spot friendly faces in the crowd, but most of the townspeople she knew had the grace to look away, unable to meet her eyes. 100, called out a voice that made several people in the crowd stiffen. The voice belonged to Marcus Dalton, owner of the biggest saloon in town and a man whose reputation with women was as dark as his heart. He stood near the front of the crowd, his black hair slicked back and his thin mustache twitching with what might have been amusement. The way he looked at Evangeline made her feel like she needed a bath. 125, countered the portly man, not to be outdone. 150, Dalton shot back immediately. Evangeline closed her eyes briefly, trying to steel herself for whatever fate awaited her. Neither option seemed bearable, but she'd made her choice when she'd signed the papers. Better this than debtor's prison, she told herself, though the words felt hollow. The bidding slowed as the amount climbed higher than most had expected. At $175, only Dalton and one other man remained in the running. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing something unsavory about the whole proceeding. Going once at 175, Hobbs called out reluctantly. 200, the new voice cut through the air like a knife. Deep and commanding. Every head turned to see who had spoken, and Evangeline's eyes snapped open to locate the source. Standing at the edge of the crowd, having apparently just arrived, was a man unlike any of the others who had been bidding. He was tall, easily 6'2", with broad shoulders that strained against his brown leather vest. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, touching his collar, and his face was weathered by sun and wind in a way that spoke of honest outdoor work. But it was his eyes that caught Evangeline's attention, deep brown and serious, but not unkind. James Mitchell had ridden into town that afternoon to purchase supplies for his ranch, but the crowd around the auction platform had drawn his curiosity. When he'd realized what was happening, something had stirred in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way the woman on the platform held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Or maybe it was the predatory look in Marcus Dalton's eyes that made his jaw clench with protective instinct. 200, he repeated. Stepping forward through the crowd, Dalton's face darkened. 225, he snapped. James didn't hesitate. 300! A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $300 was more than many of them would see in 5 years of hard work. Dalton's face went red with anger, but he wasn't about to be outbid by some ranch hand. 350, he called out. James studied the man for a long moment, taking in the expensive clothes and the cruel set of his mouth. He'd heard stories about Dalton, about the girls who worked in his saloon and what happened to them when they tried to leave. The thought of this proud woman ending up in that situation made something protective rise in his chest. $500, James said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the square. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Even Hobbs looked stunned by the amount. Dalton's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. 500 going once, Hobbs called out, clearly hoping to end this before it got any uglier. Dalton looked like he wanted to bid higher, but $500 was a fortune, more than his saloon brought in during a good month. His eyes met James's across the crowd, and something he saw there made him step back. Going twice, Hobbs continued. Sold to the gentleman for $500, Hobbs announced with obvious relief. The crowd began to disperse, most people shaking their heads in amazement at the amount that had been paid. James made his way through the thinning crowd toward the platform, his expression unreadable. Evangeline watched him approach, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been saved from Dalton's clutches. But what did she know about this stranger who had paid such an enormous sum for her contract? She studied his face as he climbed the steps to the platform, searching for some clue about his intentions. James stopped in front of her, his brown eyes meeting her green ones directly. Up close, she could see the strength in his weathered hands, the honest lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. Miss Ross, he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. I'm James Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, she replied, pleased that her voice came out steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside her. I have a ranch about 10 miles north of town, James continued. I could use help with the house and cooking if you're agreeable to the arrangement. Evangeline nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The kindness in his voice was unexpected after the humiliation of the last hour. James turned to Hobbs, who was wiping his brow and looking eager to be done with the whole business. I'll need the contract papers, James said. Of course, Hobbs replied, fumbling with a leather folder. Everything's in order. 2-year term, $500 to satisfy the debt. As Hobbs handed over the papers, James glanced through them quickly, his jaw tightening as he read the terms. The contract essentially made Evangeline an indentured servant, bound to whoever held the papers for 2 full years with no rights and no recourse. There's just one problem with this contract, James said quietly. Hobbs looked up nervously. Problem, sir. It's not what I agreed to pay for, James said, pulling out a match and striking it against the platform railing. I don't understand, Hobbs sputtered. James held the flame to the corner of the contract papers, watching as they caught fire and began to burn. I paid $500 for Miss Ross's freedom, not for ownership of another human being. Evangeline gasped, staring at James in shock as the papers turned to ash in his hands. Around them, the few remaining onlookers watched in amazement. Sir, you can't just burn legal documents, Hobbs protested weakly. I just did, James replied calmly, and I'm prepared to pay Miss Ross's debts directly to the bank, with no strings attached. He turned to Evangeline, his expression gentle but serious. "You're free to go wherever you want, Miss Ross. You don't owe me or anyone else a single day of work." Evangeline felt tears spring to her eyes. "I don't understand. Why would you?" "Because no person should be bought and sold like cattle," James said simply. "And because something tells me you've got more strength and dignity than half the men in this town put together." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her completely. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied. "But if you find yourself in need of honest work and a safe place to stay, my offer stands. I do need help at the ranch, and I'd pay fair wages for fair work. No contracts, no obligations beyond what any employee would have." Evangeline looked into his brown eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in a man's gaze for a long time. Respect. Not the calculating assessment of her worth as property, not the leering appraisal of her physical attributes, but simple human respect. "I would be honored to work for you, Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly. James smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his whole face. "The honor would be mine, Miss Ross, and please, call me James," as they walked away from the platform together, leaving Hobbs standing there with his mouth agape. Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The ride to James's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Evangeline had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with groves of cottonwood trees and crossed by clear running streams. James drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the land in a voice that spoke of deep love for the place. He'd chosen to make his home. "I came out here 5 years ago," he explained as they topped a rise that gave them a view of the valley below. "Had some money saved from working other men's ranches back in Kansas, and I wanted a place of my own." "It's beautiful," Evangeline said, and meant it. The vastness of the landscape made her feel small, but also somehow free, as if all the problems of civilization had been left far behind. "It can be lonely," James admitted, "especially in winter when the snow gets deep and you might not see another soul for weeks at a time. But there's something about this country that gets into your blood, makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself." As they approached the ranch buildings, Evangeline could see that James had built something substantial here. The main house was a solid log structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. "It's wonderful," she said, genuinely impressed. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it," James replied, pulling the wagon up in front of the house. "Had some help from neighbors during barn raising and such. That's the way it works out here. Folks help each other when help is needed." He climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon, his hands strong and careful as he lifted her down. For a moment they stood close together, and Evangeline caught the scent of leather and honest sweat, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "Let me show you around," James said, stepping back and gesturing toward the house. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship and windows that let in plenty of light. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a large cast-iron stove and ample counter space for food preparation. "The previous arrangement I had was with Mrs. Patterson from town," James explained, showing her around. "She came out twice a week to cook and clean, but it wasn't really working out. The place needs someone with a woman's touch on a daily basis." He showed her to a comfortable bedroom on the ground floor, complete with its own washstand and a window that looked out over the garden space behind the house. "This would be your room," he said. "You'd have complete privacy, and you're free to come and go as you please. I work the ranch from dawn to dusk most days, so you'd have the run of the house during those hours." Evangeline walked to the window and looked out at the space that could become a garden with the right care. "What happened to the previous owner?" she asked. "There wasn't one," James said. "I built this place from the ground up. The room was always intended for, well, I suppose I always hoped someday there might be a wife to share this place with. But so far that hasn't worked out." Something in his voice made her turn to look at him. "Why not a man like you with a place like this?" James shrugged, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. I'm not much for town socializing. And the kind of women who are willing to come out to a remote ranch usually have their sights set on men with more to offer than a simple cowboy. More to offer. Evangeline couldn't hide her surprise. James, you own thousands of acres of beautiful land. You've built a prosperous ranch with your own hands, and you just paid $500 to free a complete stranger from a terrible situation. What more could any reasonable woman want? James looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. I suppose I've been meeting the wrong kind of women. That evening, as Evangeline prepared their first meal together in the spacious kitchen, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. This morning she'd awakened in a cramped room above the general store, facing the prospect of being sold to the highest bidder. Now she was cooking dinner in a beautiful kitchen, working for a man who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than she'd received in the 6 months since her father's death. James came in from the barn as she was putting the finishing touches on a meal of roast chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from the root cellar. He'd washed up at the pump outside, and his hair was still damp from the cold water. Smells incredible, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. I can't remember the last time this house smelled like a real home. They sat down to eat at the simple wooden table, and Evangeline was struck by how comfortable the silence was between them. James ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting her cooking in ways that made her cheeks warm with pleasure. Tell me about yourself, he said as they finished the main course. What was your life like before? All this, Evangeline set down her fork, considering how much to share. My father owned a boarding house in town. After my mother died when I was 15, I helped him run it. We had a good life, simple, but good. When he passed, I thought I could keep it going on my own, but the debts were larger than I'd realized. No other family, none to speak of. My father's brother lives back east, but we haven't spoken in years. She paused, then decided on honesty. To tell the truth, I think he disapproves of the way I've chosen to live my life. How so? Evangeline smiled ruefully. I'm 26 and unmarried, for one thing. Where he comes from, that makes me something of a curiosity. And I've always been, well, larger than most women. Taller, more substantial. He once told my father I'd never find a husband because I intimidated men. James set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. He said that to you? Not directly, but I overheard the conversation. And to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. I've had suitors over the years, but they always seem to want me to be smaller somehow, quieter, more delicate. Then they were fools, James said with such conviction that Evangeline looked up in surprise. James, any man who wants a woman to make herself smaller isn't worthy of her in the first place, he said firmly. A real man wants a partner who can stand beside him as an equal, not someone who has to diminish herself to make him feel important. The passion in his voice surprised her, and she found herself studying his face in the lamplight. You sound like you speak from experience. James was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I was engaged once back in Kansas. Sarah was a lovely woman, small, delicate, everything a lady was supposed to be. But she wanted me to be something I wasn't. Wanted me to give up ranching and become a businessman in town. Wear fancy clothes and join the right social clubs. What happened? I realized that if she couldn't love me as I was, then what we had wasn't really love at all. It was just two people trying to fit each other into predetermined molds. He looked at Evangeline directly. I decided I'd rather be alone than spend my life pretending to be someone else. Evangeline felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than words. I understand that feeling completely. Do you? In my experience, most people want to change the things about you that make you who you are. They claim to love you, but only if you'll agree to become their version of what you should be. James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Then we've both learned the value of being ourselves, haven't we? The touch of his hand sent warmth shooting up her arm, and Evangeline felt her breath catch. There was something about this man that drew her in ways she'd never experienced before. Not just his physical presence, though that was certainly affecting her, but something deeper. A sense of recognition, as if she'd found someone who understood her in ways that others never had. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural to both of them. Evangeline threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, cooking meals that filled the air with delicious aromas, tending a garden that flourished under her care, and bringing touches of beauty and comfort to rooms that had been merely functional before. James, for his part, found himself looking forward to the end of each workday in ways he never had before. Coming home to a house filled with warmth and the sound of Evangeline's singing was a pleasure he hadn't known he was missing. She had a beautiful voice, rich and full, and she often sang while she worked, filling the house with melodies that made even the most mundane tasks seem pleasant. They developed an easy companionship, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings, working together on weekend projects around the ranch. James was struck by Evangeline's capability and strength. She could help him move heavy furniture, assist with ranch work when needed, and handle any task he could think of with competence and grace. "You're nothing like the women I grew up around," he told her one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Is that good or bad?" Evangeline asked, settling more comfortably into the chair beside his. "It's perfect," James said simply. "Those women were all so fragile, like they might break if you looked at them too hard. You're solid, real. A man doesn't have to worry about protecting you from every little thing because you're strong enough to handle whatever comes." Evangeline felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I've always been told that my size and strength were flaws, things that made me less feminine." "Then you were told wrong," James said firmly. "There's nothing more feminine than a woman who's comfortable in her own skin, who doesn't apologize for taking up space in the world." As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship began to shift in subtle ways. James found excuses to spend more time in the house, helping with tasks that didn't really require his assistance. Evangeline caught herself watching for his return each evening, her heart lifting when she heard his boots on the porch steps. The first snow of the season came early, blanketing the ranch in pristine white and trapping them together in the cozy warmth of the house. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. "What do you want, Evangeline?" James asked her one night as they sat before the crackling fireplace. "If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Evangeline considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, her answer would have been simple: security, a roof over her head, enough food to eat. But being here with James had awakened dreams she'd thought were long buried. "I want a home," she said finally. "Not just a place to live, but a real home, somewhere I belong, with people who value me for who I am rather than who they think I should be." "And what about love?" James asked quietly. Evangeline's heart skipped a beat at the intensity in his voice. "What about it? Do you want love in your life?" She looked at him across the small space that separated their chairs, seeing the firelight dance across his strong features. "I want the kind of love that makes you stronger, not smaller. The kind that celebrates who you are instead of trying to change you." James stood up slowly and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his larger ones. "Evangeline, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked down into his earnest brown eyes. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Actually, I think I started falling the moment I saw you on that platform, holding your head high despite everything they were putting you through. You were magnificent, and you still are." Evangeline felt tears spring to her eyes. "James." "I know this complicates things," he continued, his thumbs stroking over the backs of her hands. "I know you came here as an employee, and I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. But I needed you to know how I feel." "You think I'm magnificent?" she whispered, the words seeming too wonderful to be true. "I think you're the most beautiful, strongest, most amazing woman I've ever met," James said with conviction. "I love your height, your strength, the way you fill a room with your presence. I love that you're not afraid to take up space in the world, that you don't apologize for being exactly who you are." A tear slipped down Evangeline's cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. I was afraid to even think it, but I do. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. James reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tear. Don't be frightened. We'll figure this out together. When he kissed her, it was with a reverence that took her breath away. His lips were gentle but sure, and Evangeline felt something inside her unfurl like a flower in sunlight. This was what she'd been waiting for her whole life, not just physical attraction, but a deep recognition of souls that understood each other completely. "Marry me," James said against her lips. Evangeline pulled back to look at him, her heart soaring. "Are you sure that's not just the firelight and the snow talking?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," James said firmly. "I want to spend the rest of my life loving you exactly as you are. I want to build something beautiful with you, right here in this place we both love." "Yes," Evangeline whispered, and then louder with joy filling her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you." When James stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around, Evangeline laughed with pure happiness. Here was a man who wasn't intimidated by her height or her strength, who celebrated rather than tolerated the things that made her unique. "You're just right for my arms," James said as he set her down, echoing words that seemed to come from his very soul. Perfect in every way. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that took place right there on the ranch with half the county in attendance. Evangeline wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd sewn herself, designed to flatter her tall figure rather than hide it. James couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him across the meadow, where wildflowers bloomed in glorious abundance. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs, hard times and celebrations, but through it all, they faced everything together as true partners. Evangeline's strength proved invaluable during difficult seasons, and James's unwavering support allowed her to flourish in ways she'd never imagined possible. They had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl, all of whom inherited their mother's height and their father's steady strength. Evangeline taught them that being different wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate. James showed them that real love meant accepting and cherishing people exactly as they were. As the years passed, the story of their meeting became something of a legend in the area. People spoke of the auction where a beautiful woman had been put up for sale like livestock, and how a cowboy had paid an enormous sum not to own her but to set her free. The tale grew in the telling, but the heart of it remained true. Sometimes love means seeing the value in someone that others have overlooked, and sometimes freedom is the most precious gift one person can give another. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where James had first told her he loved her, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come to town that day?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their children play in the yard. "Every day," James said, tightening his arm around her. "And every day I thank God that I was exactly where I needed to be when you needed me most." "I used to think my size was a curse," Evangeline said, "that I was too much for any man to handle." "You are too much," James said with a smile in his voice. "Too much beauty, too much strength, too much love to contain. And that's exactly what makes you perfect for me." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and pink, Evangeline marveled at how completely her life had changed. She'd gone from being someone no one wanted to being cherished beyond measure. She'd found not just love, but a partner who celebrated every aspect of who she was. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story of unexpected love and the courage to see beyond society's narrow definitions touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need to be reminded of their own worth today. Sometimes we all need to hear that we're just right exactly as we are. Your like and subscription help these stories of hope and acceptance reach others who may be struggling to see their own value. Together, we can continue sharing tales that celebrate the beauty of authentic love and the strength found in being true to ourselves. Thank you for being part of this community that believes everyone deserves to be cherished for who they truly are.